Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
Hello, this is John Bicknell. This episode is being released on Tuesday, November 29th, and we are only 2 short weeks away from our special live podcast recording. That's right, on Wednesday, December the 14th from 12 noon until 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be having an IPA members social and live podcast recording where Dr. Chris Paul and Mr. Matt Armstrong will discuss a recent article that they co-authored entitled The Irony of Misinformation, USIA Myths Blocking Enduring Solutions. So if you are an information professional, or if you are just an interested citizen to learn more about some of the major forces which are impacting our diplomacy efforts, you are not going to want to miss out on this conversation and the opportunity to ask questions to Chris Paul and Matt Armstrong. During this gathering as well, IPA will present some of our initiatives for the upcoming year, which will be of great interest to the IPA community. In order to join this special live podcast recording, however, you will need to be an IPA member. So head on over to information-professionals.org and sign up if you are not a member already. We have several membership options which can fit into your budget, and rest assured that your donation will go straight towards supporting our mission, which is to provide a forum for information professionals to interact, collaborate, and develop solutions that enhance the cognitive security of the U.S. and our friends and allies. Also, please follow IPA on LinkedIn and Twitter for more information about this live podcast and how you can participate. Finally, if you haven't done so, it would be really helpful if you go on to your podcast app and rate the show and leave a review. This will help algorithms be sure that this podcast get delivered to others like you who appreciate the conversations that we have on the Cognitive Crucible. And now on to today's episode. My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dean Cheng, who is a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Dean Cheng, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me.
The conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Dean, will cover China, space, and information operations. So 3 big topics that we're going to try to interleave together a little bit here. But before we get into this, could you please give our audience a little bit more background about your career and simultaneously try to sketch out the way you see our strategic landscape right now in late 2022?
So let's see. I recently retired from the Heritage Foundation after about 13 years there. The Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank, and interestingly, their focus is Congress. So we had a lot of interaction with Congress while I was there. Before that, I was with the Center for Naval Analysis, a federally funded research and development center, sort of like the RAND Corporation, where focused on Chinese military doctrine. And before that was with SAIC, the Fortune 500 consulting company, and before that with the U.S. Congress's Office of Technology Assessment, starting back in around 1992. So I guess what that shows is I have trouble holding a job. But over the course of these 30 years and the various think tanks with different target audiences, what's been very clear is the growth of the People's Republic of China, the growing capabilities that they field, but at the same time, the very different approach to the world that the PRC takes. And while there isn't a good European model to compare it to, and let me emphasize here that I think comparisons with either Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany are frankly terrible, if only because China has 5,000 years of history and there was no Germany as recently as, say, 1850. The best comparison I would actually give to today's China is France after the Franco-Prussian War. A major power laid low with territory that had been torn away, that then set about righting this wrong, in their view, and inculcating into their policies, defense, economic, popular culture, the spirit of revanche, the spirit of righting these wrongs. And that for China today is the so-called Century of Humiliation, 1839 to 1949. 1842 to 1949. And Xi Jinping's China Dream, if you read a little further down, is the great revival of the Chinese people. And that includes, because in the view of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, we live now in the information age. Information is the currency of power, both domestic and international. And it is vital for China to be able to dominate information, not just the technology, but the transmission of it, the spread of it, and how it's interpreted, the cognitive aspect. And all of that is part of the Chinese approach to both domestic governance, Great Firewall of China, all the censorship, et cetera, as well as how they deal with other countries.
So we hear frequently, Dean, these days, the concept of great power competition. How does that land with you?
Well, so from the Chinese perspective, there's always been great power competition. And at the same time, there's never been great power competition. I know that sounds evasive, so let me explain. China has a history of 5,000 years at least. This is a point of pride. For most of that period, they dominated Asia. There was no great power competition in Asia. You had China, Zhongguo, which translates as the Middle Kingdom, and that's fine, that's a good translation. But it's also the Central Kingdom. And all along the periphery were tributary states, right? The Khmers, the Thais, the Malays, the Koreans. And they didn't challenge the Central Kingdom. Compare that with Europe, where you had multiple great powers all engaging in constant balancing. So as Americans, we are the inheritors of the European diplomatic tradition. Major powers aligning with each other, forming alliances, countering the rise of any single dominant power, Hitler, Napoleon, the Soviet Union, to basically maintain a balanced power structure versus a China that sees the world for 5,000 years as us, the dominant power, and the rest of you, frankly, barbarians. And then you had the Century of Humiliation where China's laid low. So for us, it's the end of the unipolar moment. We now see great powers competing with each other again. From the Chinese perspective, this great revival, what they are hoping for is a return to the dominant China, at least over Asia, but arguably worldwide. China should, at a minimum, be first among equals. And frankly, there aren't too many equals.
Yeah, I see the term great power competition as a tool for Westerners to help shift our mindset more so than it's something that probably resonates with China, as you were just describing. It's just like competition. What competition? From the Chinese perspective, perhaps. I think, Dean, that you tend to be a vocal critic of the kinds of things that the West and the United States are doing, like currently, in order to interact with China. But before we get into some of those, I think, constructive criticisms, do you perceive any geopolitical bright spots for the West currently?
Well, first off, the Russians have managed to sort of take themselves out of the running. Because of the Russia-Ukraine war, they're not doing well, at least as of when this podcast is being recorded. And they had set themselves, or tried to set themselves up as one of the key poles. The interesting thing, however, is that a weaker Russia will probably wind up more dependent on China. And so that doesn't necessarily, that plays in a mixed way to us. I think the biggest advantages the West has are, first, frankly, even with aging populations and the rest, we have a much better demographic, long-term structural advantage than the Chinese do. They have huge problems coming up. Second is that the Chinese are actively shooting themselves in the feet, reloading and shooting again, by discouraging innovation. And that has to do with the political system in the PRC. The West, so long as we are open to innovation and don't allow our own systems to either ossify or fall prey to too many special interests, can innovate. And capitalism is a key part of that, the creative destruction that says, hey, we are open to new ideas, even if that will cause some pain in the short run. And I guess the other piece to all of this is, Xi Jinping has basically ensured that he will stay in power for at least another 5 years, probably 10. 20 years in power, by the time all is said and done, or possibly more, discourages both innovation, political reform, political openness. That's Xi's problem, not just the CCP's problem, in a system that faces a lot of trouble in terms of its internal economics and its demographics. So in the longer term, I'm fairly actually optimistic. It's the shorter term, it's getting to there. What will China do? How will we respond? How will China exploit its positions in everything from supply chains to its economy to its massive Navy and Air Force, and its better understanding, I would suggest, of information warfare and operations? That poses a great challenge between now and when I think the writing will be very clear on the wall for the Chinese.
So let me flip that question, Dean, and ask you if you can comment on some places where you think China might have some advantages.
Well, I think one of the biggest places China has an advantage, and this is for better or worse the result of being an authoritarian system, is they are able to think longer term. And by this, I'm not talking about 100 years or 1,000 years. What I'm talking about are things like programmatic stability. They have a 5-year plan, and they actually stick to that 5-year plan, and they hash things out in discussing the 5-year plan. But once it's set in the 5-year plan, then they don't go and do change orders and all that sort of stuff for the most part. Instead, it's like, in this 5-year plan, we see in their space white paper, for example, we intend to put a robotic mission on the moon. We're going to land on the far side of the moon several times. You know what? That's going to happen between now and 2025. We see things like Made in China 2025. 10 technology areas the Chinese are pushing very hard to become 70% self-supplying. Will they hit that? Maybe not across all 10, but they are going to be very consistently pushing that effort. They don't have elections, but they also don't have internal bureaucratic battles of the sort we have. They have different bureaucratic battles, believe me, that basically say, look, we've agreed on this. This is how we're going to push forward. Another example is civil military fusion. What that is civil military integration, industrial policies, mobilization planning, etc. One of the interesting things about this is that China still sees itself as poor. It is the number 2 GDP, but it's spread over 1.3 billion people. So GDP per capita is actually quite low. So from the Chinese perspective, we have to make every renminbi count. And in the United States, we have 4 space programs. China can only afford 1. So that space program better meet national security needs, but also economic and development needs, infrastructure needs, etc. So civil military fusion, in at least some aspects, is something that we could probably learn something from. While we do need to recognize the Chinese probably pay more attention, ironically, to national security in this regard. So their supply chains are likely to be a bit more secure, if only because it's not entirely based off of simply lowest bidder, lowest cost.
Maybe we can start stepping into information operations just a little bit more, Dean. And I know that you have written extensively on information operations and China's brand of information operations. I heard you in another forum talk about some structural moves that China has made in recent years, which goes right to the heart of some of these issues. Could you unpack that a little bit for our audience, please?
Sure. So because the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is a Marxist-Leninist party, one of the things that they believe is that human activities are governed by immutable laws, the same way the world of objects and physics is. And so they have an approach of military science, and that military science responds to broader realities like the idea that we now live in the information age. So if we live in the information age and economies and power politics is all about information, then winning future wars is going to be about achieving what they term information dominance, 自信喜权. And that means gathering information, analyzing information, transmitting information, exploiting information more rapidly and more accurately than than your adversaries can, and interfering with your adversary's ability to do all those things. To that end, one of the most interesting things that occurred in 2016 in the most massive overhaul of the People's Liberation Army since its founding in 1927 was the creation. There were a whole lot of changes, but for this podcast, one of the most important was the creation of the so-called PLA Strategic Support Force. And really, when you look at its components, it's really the PLA Information Warfare Force.
What time frame would you say this is approximately, Dean?
Literally founded December 31st, 2015, and been going gangbusters since.
Okay.
So it brought together in one service China's electronic warfare forces, the people who do jamming of radars and radios and all that sort of thing, the network warfare forces, so cyber, but so much more, because it's not about just hacking in bits and bytes. It's about determining and then preserving networks on your own side and damaging the other side's networks, information networks, but also energy networks, air traffic networks, transportation networks, power networks. There's space forces, and most interestingly, perhaps, there are political warfare forces. Base 311, which used to be a general political department base, where they where they trained and staffed the forces that do political warfare, got transferred out of that to this new service. Political warfare for China includes public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. And so these forces that do space and electronic warfare and network warfare and all that work alongside the people who are trying to manipulate how you think about, how you judge. In, I think, psychology terms, it's inference. You and I would probably refer to it as judgment or cognition. Warfare. That's a single service that does all of that because it's all aspects of information.
Well, I guess I just want to foot stomp all of that. And so we also recently, Dean, had a gentleman on the podcast from RAND. His name is Jeff Engstrom, and you may know Jeff, but he co-authored, or maybe he was the sole author of a rather extensive paper which unpacks China's systems warfare outlook. Does systems warfare play right into everything that you were just talking about with the PLA Strategic Support Force?
So this is one of the areas where actually Chinese works better than English. The Chinese have two different terms. One is 系统, that is systems. The other is 体系, system of systems. And if I remember right, Jeff's paper is about system of systems warfare, because that is how the Chinese think about future warfare. They see future warfare, they term it as informationized local wars, meaning, again, the role of information is paramount in wars that are relatively limited, not global thermonuclear war, in other words. But the method of those wars is going to be system of systems versus system of systems. And the whole idea here is that there are certain nodes, particularly in the decision-making, but also information transmission and information gathering. You hit those, you discombobulate them, you disrupt them, and the entire structure of the adversary decoheres. And conversely, you are going to spend an enormous effort to preserve your own system of systems. So the way to think about this, I guess, is, take a tank. The gun, your 120 millimeter Rheinmetall, is a weapon. The tank, the engine, the electronics, the sites, that's a system. So your tank is a system, but your system of systems is all the comms, all the supporting elements, everything from electronic warfare to helicopters to UAVs to satellites that make your tank really effective because it is embedded in a system of systems. And so for the Chinese, their point is, what is tying that together? And it's information. How is that information being transmitted electronically, data links from space, et cetera? Disrupt those, and your tank fights individually. Maybe your company or your battalion is still coherent, but your brigade and your division is not. And if my stuff is operating coherently and you're not, I'm going to roll right over you.
Right. So you've mentioned this word a couple of times, and I guess I want to bring it more into the forefront of the discussion. Space, outer space. How does that fit into this whole discussion? How does China perceive the space domain? Are there differences in the way China sees it compared to us, or the West in general?
Sure. So for the Chinese, they view space, first off, very holistically. When they talk about space dominance, they're not simply talking about having more satellites and keeping those satellites alive. They are talking about the satellites, the stuff in orbit. They're also talking about the ground segment, mission control, tracking telemetry and control, downlink sites, uplink sites, and then the data links that tie it all together. So that's your system of systems. Your stuff in orbit, your terrestrial element, your data links, disrupt any of them, and you can, in theory, achieve space dominance. Now, one of the things, though, that is important to keep in mind is we in China are fundamentally different in our reliance on space. We, the United States, fight away games. That's a good thing. Don't get me wrong, right? I'm not, one would never hope to fight wars on your own soil. But the reality is that the prospects for now of a conflict somewhere in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean or off, Long Island, is low. So we have to go abroad. And the physics of that says to do communications, et cetera, you're going to probably need satellites, especially for ships at sea. So we are very dependent on space. We have chosen to be dependent on GPS for our position navigation timing functions. We are very reliant on space for weather information, for doing, taking photographs of the bad guys, et cetera. China's wars, prospective wars, are all home games. Taiwan, South China Sea, Senkakus, Sino-Indian border. They don't need space to monitor those areas. They don't need space to necessarily communicate with a lot of those areas. They don't need space as much to maintain surveillance. You can use UAVs, you can use aircraft, you can use the world's largest fishing fleet, the world's largest merchant fleet, radio direction finding, all of those aspects. So the Chinese are also have much more the option of counter space capabilities than we do. And that's one of the functions of the PLA Strategic Support Force. Use space when necessary to support their own forces, and definitely to engage in denial of space to your adversary. And then, going back to civil military fusion and the like, they have a single space program, partly because all of their space facilities are military. They are run by the People's Liberation Army, back to the PLA Strategic Support Force. As I said, we have 4 space programs. We have NASA. We have NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, does things like Landsat and weather satellites. We have the US military, now the Space Force. And we have the intelligence community, which runs its own satellites. So we have 4, they have 1, and they basically need their space program to do all the duties for developing Xinjiang or developing Shanghai or developing Yunnan, as well as for the People's Liberation Army.
So the way you articulated that, if I could put it very crudely, it's for the United States and the West, in a national security context, space is critical. It is vital. But for the Chinese, space could be considered a nice to have, but not absolutely mandatory. Do you think that that is a crude but accurate way of saying it?
I think it is. I think that's very accurate. And I think that one of the great flaws in our system is we have this assumption that they will become as dependent on space as we are,
Mm.
despite one, the very different strategic requirements, and two, the reality that the Chinese are very good at learning from other people, and they have seen us become dependent on space. Why would they choose to replicate that dependence if they don't have to be? Um, and the fact that we are dependent, and for them it's good to have, but not vital, is a huge factor when you think about, am I willing to commit the resources? Am I going to invest that level of money and effort? And am I willing to accept that level of vulnerability?
There was a nifty request for proposals a couple of years ago from a Department of Defense organization, I forget what, but uh, the overall gist was looking for technologies which are not spoofable or more resilient to say tampering with, and one of the solicitations was like looking for like artificial intelligence methodologies to do celestial navigation instead of relying on GPS and data, satellite data sources as a redundant capability, just in case the space domain becomes completely inoperable or the data from space becomes unreliable. What do you think about that kind of a technological backup?
I think it's long overdue. And I think that in many cases, as Americans, we are fascinated by the latest gadget, right? People stand in line for days for the next iteration of the iPhone. Um, I'm I'm old enough to remember when we were getting CEPs on Minuteman threes that were less than 100 meters, based off of celestial, snapshots. We had something called LORAN, which was a radio frequency, a radio beacon network around the world that guided aircraft for decades, long before GPS. It cost a few $100 million. I mean, at this point, in terms of budgets, that's a rounding error at best. It disappears in terms of significant figures. But we shut it down because we said, well, we have GPS. Why would you need something like that? And now there's talk about ELORAN and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, those kinds of global terrestrial radio beacons, etc. Is it spoofable? Good question. My guess is anything is spoofable at some level. But having something like that, especially if you made it very extensive, would be something that would be still cheap, offer a backup, and allow us to operate even if space was denied for, especially for navigation and timing purposes.
I'd like to transition our conversation slightly, Dean, and I say slightly because this is all heavily technological in context. But another person that I want to invite onto this podcast, probably in the new year, is a lady named Doreen Bogdan, and she was just elected last month to be the new Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU. So I would imagine that the ITU is not a household term for a lot of people in our audience, but could you describe what this United Nations organization is and how China has been engaging with it over the last couple of decades?
So bandwidth is a resource. There's actually a limit to how much bandwidth is available. And there's a lot of different competing demands, everything from television and radio to air traffic control to missile guidance to the key fob that allows you to start, open your door from 10 feet away. That bandwidth has to be managed globally, and it has been managed pretty much by the United Nations International Telecommunications Union, which assigns which chunk of bandwidth is available for what. And interestingly, also, when you launch a communication satellite in particular, you need to inform ITU, hey, this new ComSat is going to be operating on this bandwidth, and it will have this many transponders, and this is how it's going to operate.
I think that the ITU also is the body that helps assign like the orbital slots within the geobelt as well.
Yes, well, you definitely have to coordinate with them.
Yes,
So
yes,
they don't
yeah.
have formal control over that. Nobody has full formal control over that. But yes, ITU absolutely has a piece of that
Okay.
as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, really, in a sense, ITU is almost the traffic cop of bandwidth, right? To make sure that, hey, this satellite doesn't interfere with that satellite by being too close, and therefore their transponders would overlay, etc. So far, all of this is all well and good. Nothing particularly problematic. The problematic part begins when you have a Chinese person in charge of the ITU, which we've had for until the recent accession of Dr. Bogdan. Because among the other things that the Chinese would like to have seen is the end of the competing organization. There is something called the International Corporation for the Assignment of Names and Numbers, ICANN. ICANN is, in a sense, a traffic cop of the internet. And what they do is they assign domains. So as Americans, we don't have to worry too much about domains. Everybody else has a little dot, 2 letters or 3 letters after their names to basically say, hey, this is a Czech site, or this is a Ethiopian site, or this is a Chinese site. ICANN, and the name gives it away, is a corporation, meaning it's not a government agency, and it believes in the multi-stakeholder approach, which means nation states have a seat, companies have a seat, religious organizations and NGOs have a seat, and ICANN assigned .tw to Taiwanese websites. And that ticked off Beijing like you wouldn't believe, because Taiwan is part of China, according to Beijing, and therefore, why would they have their own little domain when they should be happy with a .chn China related website? More importantly, why do religious organizations or any entity other than a nation state have a role in internet management and governance? The UN's ITU, its name also gives away, the United Nations ITU, which means only nations, for the most part, have a seat at their table. So the head of the ITU has an enormous amount of implicit power. And when the Chinese ran it, they repeatedly tried to shove ICANN out the door, to basically grab as much of that authority over the internet, not over bandwidth, to the ITU, so that they could then manipulate it in support of China's rules. That's before we hit the whole issue of industrial standards and China Standards 2035, which is a new Chinese effort to also influence global industrial standards. Again, using nation states as the key advocacy arena. So the arrival of an American who will probably take her oath to be impartial and to not think in terms of her original nation of origin is going to be an enormous change at ITU, because unfortunately, Chinese officials across international organizations, especially at the UN, are on record in China as basically saying, my job is to push Chinese policies wherever it is that I am. And there are UN officials, not the head of ITU, but other Chinese officials who have been recorded in China saying, oh, yeah, we basically made sure that the Uyghurs had no place, that the Taiwanese had no place, that, because I spoke for China, which is in violation of their oath. But the Chinese don't seem to take that very seriously.
Yeah, that's a great take on all that, Dean. Yeah. The U.S. State Department, I recall, was actively encouraging or promoting Doreen Bogdan in her candidacy for that position. So I agree with you that having someone from the West leading that body for whatever the term is going to be a good thing for the world in the short run and maybe the longer run. How long did you say, or how long could you say that the Chinese had been integrating themselves into this body? Is it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
I'd
Do you
say at
know?
least 10 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And what we have seen with other UN organizations is that China also openly uses its funding and its other economic policies to try and push forward candidates who may not be Chinese, but who are comfortable with China's position.
Hmm.
Ms.
Hmm.
Bogdan's competitor, if I remember right, was Russian. This was not a good year to be a Russian running for head of a key UN office.
Yeah, I don't
Um,
imagine. Yeah.
but he almost certainly would have been very much aligned with China, especially on the issue of internet issues, because from both Beijing and Moscow's perspective, they would love to see a balkanized internet with national boundaries in place, as opposed to the relatively open internet that we currently see.
Right. And I understand as well from another fellow that I chatted with offline that uh, China's uh, engagement with like 5G and Huawei and technology standards associated with that technology, that there's been moves, like really deep long plays that have been part of that technology stack as well with the ITU.
Absolutely. This again goes to one of the Chinese advantages we talked about earlier. Having a long-term perspective, having long-term programs means that you can also start thinking backwards, right? If I want this result in 2035, what do I have to start doing now over the next, 13 years to get there? That includes regulatory issues, that includes legal issues, that includes industrial standards issues, as well as the basic technical R&D to get there.
Right. I heard on another podcast, that's a totally separate topic, but still in in the same zip code, is that China is also trying to make a case to get them into Arctic related discussions, more so than they already are. And so there's something like seven Arctic nations. I can't list them off, but think about all the nations that touch the Arctic Circle. And China, technically, or not technically, China is not one of them. Yet they still want to be a part of. I think it's either a UN body or some kind of a transnational body that is the Arctic nations talking about Arctic related matters, and China wants to get into those discussions too, but so far they've been stymied because they're not geographically an Arctic nation.
That's absolutely right. The Arctic Council is comprised of permanent members are states that have territory literally north of the Arctic Circle. So that's countries like Norway, Denmark because of Greenland, the United States because of Alaska, Russia. Um, Other countries can be observers,
That's
especially,
what that's what it was. Yeah, yeah.
and that's becoming an issue because of the issue of climate change and the belief that you're going to wind up with what's sometimes termed the Northern Sea Route with the Northern Passage, where you could go north rather than south through a place like the Suez Canal and ship things, say, from China to Europe by going north. One of the interesting things there is that China is very touchy about the whole issue of international waters when it comes to the South China Sea, with their 9-dash line claiming this is Chinese territory. But in the north, where the Russians have said, this is within our territorial waters, the Chinese are insisting that no, these are international waterways and no one can interfere and no one should be able to interpose themselves in these international waters, which highlights a different aspect of the Chinese, which is ruled by law. They are very comfortable saying there's one set of rules for us, and there's one other set of rules for everybody else. And when you say, that's a lot like the South China Sea, they will trot out a dozen reasons why. No, totally different.
I see. Yeah, yeah. It's nice when you can make up the rules. One one last little bit on this. I'm not sure whether this was kind of a publicity stunt, which doesn't really matter a whole lot, or whether it really does matter. But I think this is like 4 or 5 or 7 years ago. I remember seeing a photograph which was like a submersible with a robotic arm placing, I think it was the Russian flag, like over the geographic North Pole, like on the bottom of the ocean.
Mhm.
Like they're placing the flag just like the United States placed the flag on the moon, except it was,
Yeah.
the North Pole. Does that have any lasting geopolitical influence?
I don't think so, in the sense that it's not a legal claim, and I doubt
Hmm.
very much either Canada or the United States, or for that matter, Norway, would accept such a claim. That being said, it is a reminder, however, that it's not just Beijing that doesn't actually accept the current rules-based international order.
Hmm.
Moscow is equally problematic in this regard.
Hmm.
Um, I would say, however, one of the big differences is that China wants a rules-based international order. Just they want to write those rules. Russia seems much more comfortable with chaos.
Yeah.
And so planting that flag is a nice touch. But if it meant, they'd be almost as comfortable ripping down other people's flags if they had done that, as putting up their own.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating, Dean. Maybe we could hit a quick lightning round and
Sure.
then close out. So lightning round, oh, I don't know, 15, 30 seconds per item or something along those
Sure.
lines. So first lightning round, space domain awareness.
Key vital issue that is going to confront all of the major spacefaring nations as there's more and more space traffic, especially with the mega constellations being put up not only by the United States, but the Chinese are openly talking about, and probably other countries as well.
Cislunar.
A growing area of competition, and one that the Chinese are showing growing interest in. They view it not so much as transportation to and from the moon as a real driving force to create a space traffic management structure for the domain, for the area between Earth and moon. By the way, that goes back to space traffic management. As well as a reliable space transportation system, meaning rockets, both single use and reusable, that will make space travel as regular as commuter, flights, or trains.
Hmm. Let me add one here. Just the moon itself, the moon.
Um, I'm not a huge believer in mining the moon for resources just yet, especially helium-3, until you show me a working fusion reactor. But both the US and China very clearly view it as a geostrategic, or space strategic, I guess, location, both in terms of water on the moon, but also a driving force, a political signal. When China lands on the moon with people and plants a Chinese flag, that is going to take away a key moment of American uniqueness. How often have you heard people say, well, we went to the moon, we can do X? Once somebody else has done it, we won't be the only ones.
Yeah, that word "we" changes meaning at that
Yes,
point.
exactly.
Um, so other strategic locations in the space domain, the Lagrange points.
The Chinese are the first to put what they term applications satellite at Lagrange, at a Lagrange point. The James Webb Space Telescope went to one, but that's a science project, a huge science project, a very impressive science project, but it's a science project. The Chinese want to use those locations, which basically is where a spacecraft will pretty much stay where it is without having to spend too much fuel for very long periods of time, for more practical applications. For example, data relay and communications. Right now, to the moon, but potentially back to Earth, but way out there as almost like a strategic reserve.
Got it. And speaking of back to Earth, last lightning round, the Confucius Institutes.
So the Confucius Institutes were Chinese government established at many universities around the world, including in the United States, intended originally to teach the Chinese language, but which increasingly has affected academic freedom and has been a way of influencing people, first by how people are educated about China, and then how universities who receive their funding are willing to talk about China. It's a good thing that many of them are being closed down, but some universities have kept them, power of money, and it is part of China's broader strategic information warfare effort, which is all about influencing and shaping how you think about China and issues dear to China, whether it's the Dalai Lama or Taiwan or Chinese economic policy.
All right, and wrapping up now, we have a lot of researchers and students who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question that may be related to the kinds of things we've been talking about that a student might take a crack at?
I think one of the interesting things that is understudied is how China is trying, the various tools China is using to influence third-party populations, which is to say folks in Africa, folks in South America, folks in the Middle East. How many Chinese students go to, how many foreign students go to Chinese institutions, and where do they wind up? Because the Chinese have been doing this for decades. How many people educated in China are now mid-level ministry officials, mid-level police officials, mid-level defense officials and military officers? And what impact does that have on that nation's policies towards the United States, towards China, towards Japan? China has invited and paid for students from Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Oman, Nigeria, to go and study in China, where they are consistently propagandized, as well as educated. Don't get me wrong. They are often given excellent educations, especially in the hard sciences. And then they go back to their countries where they put that education to work. But they are going to have a different view of China than somebody who went to the Sorbonne or to University of Iowa, and above all, are going to have a very different view of the balance of power and whether China is their friend and whether the United States is their friend.
I see. Yeah, no, that would be a really interesting report out on that. And finally, Dean, what's a good book or other online resource, perhaps, that is related to the kinds of things we've been talking about?
Whenever anyone asks me what can I read to learn more about China, I give a very offbeat recommendation. It's a book called The Geography of Thought by a sociologist, psychologist named Richard Nisbett, Nisbett. And his point is that people who grow up in different cultures look at problems differently. And that doesn't maybe seem all that striking, but it's an effort to get us out of our own shoes, right? To basically say, hey, and one of his foci is Asian decision making and judgment, and how simply coming from a different culture, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. But they look at a problem, a basic problem, very differently than we do. And so if you're going to think about Chinese policy, whether it's education policy or industrial policy, Chinese policy towards us, Chinese military policy, it's useful to sort of realize that their fundamental starting point, how they frame the problem, is going to be different from how we do.
Dean Cheng, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.